Sergeant Reynolds believed he was untouchable. For years, he had bullied, harassed, and abused his authority, especially targeting black individuals. So, when he saw a black woman in court, he didn't hesitate. He grabbed her, shoved her, and humiliated her in front of the judge and the entire courtroom. He made sure she knew who held the power. But then, she reached into her jacket and pulled out a badge. The courtroom fell silent. Reynolds staggered back, his face turning pale. This wasn't just any black woman, and in that moment, the truth set everyone in the courtroom free. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as the judge prepared to deliver the final ruling. Sergeant Reynolds stood tall, his usual smug arrogance unshaken. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He had done this countless times before, testifying against those he had arrested, many of whom had the misfortune of being black in a city where officers like him thrived on unchecked power. Today was no different, or so he thought. Then, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A woman in a sleek black suit stepped inside, her presence commanding without a single word. She moved with quiet authority, her gaze locked onto Reynolds. The murmurs faded into silence, and in that moment, he knew his time was up. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew that her mere presence commanded respect. Without a word, she took a seat in the gallery, her sharp eyes never leaving Reynolds as he continued to spew his testimony. He noticed her almost instantly. His gaze flickered with a mix of annoyance and condescension. Just another black woman, probably a relative of the accused, clinging to false hope. He smirked and turned back to the judge, dismissing her without a second thought. But then, she stood. Reynolds stiffened, his smirk faltering as his eyes narrowed. There was something different about her, something unsettling. She wasn't just another courtroom observer. There was an air of authority in the way she carried herself, a silent power that made the room feel smaller. And for the first time in a long time, doubt crept into Reynolds' mind. She stood firm, unwavering. He didn't like it. "Sit down, lady," Reynolds barked, taking a few steps toward her. "This isn't your business." The woman met his glare, unmoved. "Excuse me?" Reynolds scoffed. He lived for moments like these, reminding people like her of their place. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a sneer. "You lost. This ain't the welfare office." A hush fell over the room. The judge's gavel hovered midair, his face frozen in shock. A few people gasped audibly, but the woman remained completely still. Her dark eyes, piercing and unreadable, never wavered. And for the first time, Reynolds felt something he hadn't in years: unease. "Remove your hand." Her voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable steel edge beneath it. Reynolds' grip tightened around her arm. "Or what?" he spat, giving her a slight shove. The power surged through him. He knew this feeling well. The rush of dominance, the certainty that she would shrink away like so many others had before. He could already picture her flustered reaction, the fear in her eyes. But she didn't flinch, she didn't cower. Instead, she simply reached into her jacket. Reynolds' instincts flared, his muscles tensed, his pulse quickened. He knew this move, someone reaching into their pocket, a sudden motion. He had drawn his gun for less. The entire room held its breath. The courtroom held its breath. She pulled out a badge. The air turned to ice. Reynolds' smug grin vanished. The color drained from his face as his fingers slipped from her arm. He staggered back a step, his confidence crumbling. The badge gleamed under the overhead lights, but it wasn't just any badge. She lifted her chin slightly, her voice calm but unyielding. "Sergeant Reynolds, I am Chief Renee Carter," she announced, her words slicing through the silence like a blade. "And as of this morning, I am your new boss." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, whispers, the rustling of movement shock rippled through the room like a tidal wave. Reynolds stood frozen in place. His lips parted, but no words came out. No words came out. The weight of his actions, his arrogance, his unchecked power, came crashing down on him all at once. The judge's gavel finally struck, but its sound was lost beneath the rising murmurs, the whispers, the stunned realization that the world as Reynolds knew it had just changed forever. A heavy silence followed. Sergeant Reynolds' breath hitched. His mind scrambled to process what had just happened. Everything he had built, his authority, his dominance, his unchecked control, had rested on the belief that people like her didn't exist. Black, composed, untouchable. But Chief Renee Carter was standing right in front of him, and she wasn't going anywhere. Chief Renee Carter stood tall, her badge still gleaming under the fluorescent light. Reynolds' fingers twitched at his sides, his face contorting as he struggled to regain control, to salvage the authority slipping through his grasp. The judge tapped his gavel. "Order in the court," he commanded, though even he couldn't fully mask the intrigue simmering beneath his voice. Renee turned to him, her expression unwavering. "Your Honor, I request a private discussion regarding Sergeant Reynolds' conduct, both today and throughout his career. I believe it will be relevant to these proceedings." The judge hesitated, studying her carefully. Reynolds could practically feel the walls closing in. A shift rippled through the room. The power Reynolds once wielded was slipping through his fingers. "Very well, Chief Carter," the judge finally said. "We'll recess for 15 minutes. Reynolds felt the air leave his lungs. The judge had actually listened to her. As people began filing out of the courtroom, Renee turned, locking eyes with him. The intensity in her gaze made him feel smaller than he had in his entire career. Renee Carter hadn't always worn a badge. Born and raised in the very city that had failed so many, she had seen firsthand how the system worked and who it worked against. Was to change it from within. Renee had learned early that the system didn't work for people who looked like her. Her father, a local pastor, had always preached about justice, but he also knew that justice was rare for black families in their neighborhood. She was 16 when the truth became undeniable. Renee had stood frozen, clutching her mother's hand, as officers pulled her older brother over for matching a description. She watched, helpless, as they dragged him from his car, slammed him against the hood, and locked him in cuffs. He hadn't done anything wrong, but that hadn't mattered. That night had shaped her. She knew then that the only way to fight a corrupt system was to dismantle it from the inside. Had to get inside it, to change it. Despite every obstacle, the racism at the academy, white officers doubting her authority, superiors questioning her decisions, she had climbed the ranks. And now, she was here, the first black female police chief in the city's history. Her first order of business? Cleaning out the rot. Reynolds paced the empty aisle, his pulse hammering in his throat. He needed to fix this. Fast. He had connections. People who had protected him for years. People who wouldn't let this happen. Grabbing his phone, he quickly dialed. "Yeah, it's me," he muttered, voice low and urgent. Reynolds whispered into the phone the moment the line picked up. "We have a problem." Renee stood in a private room with the judge and the defense attorney. "Your Honor," she said, placing a thick folder on the table. "Before we continue with Jamal's case, I want you to see something." The judge opened the folder. Inside were pages of records, complaints, lawsuits, excessive force reports, dozens of them, and all with one name attached: Sergeant Reynolds. The judge's face darkened. "Why haven't I seen this before?" "Because Reynolds was protected," Renee answered simply. She met the judge's eyes, unwavering. But not anymore. A sudden knock at the door. An officer stepped inside. The officer stepped in, his expression uneasy. "Chief Carter, you might want to see this." Renee followed him into the hallway. Outside the courthouse, a crowd was already gathering, reporters, cameras, bystanders. And at the center of it all stood Reynolds, flanked by a lawyer and a few high-ranking officers, speaking into a microphone. "This is a political hit job," he declared, his voice carrying over the noise. "I have done nothing wrong. I am being targeted because I uphold the law." Renee clenched her jaw. Of course, he was going to fight this. He wasn't the type to go down quietly, but that was fine, because she was ready. She stood at the courthouse entrance, watching the scene unfold, her eyes locked on Reynolds. This wasn't just about him. This was about the system that had protected him. And she wasn't stopping until it was dismantled. The media circus unfolded. Reynolds was already spinning his narrative, playing the victim, framing himself as a dedicated cop under attack. "This is what happens when you do your job," he said, shaking his head in feigned frustration. "I've spent years protecting this city, putting criminals behind bars, and now, because of political games, my career is being destroyed." Renee's fists clenched at her sides. She had seen this before, how men like him twisted reality, cast themselves as martyrs, and manipulated the truth to maintain their power. But this time, she wouldn't let the truth be buried. Not now, not ever. As Renee re-entered the courtroom, her phone vibrated. A message from Internal Affairs. Be careful. Reynolds still has people protecting him. She sighed, already knowing this wouldn't be an easy fight. But she had prepared for this moment for years. The judge called the session back into order, his gaze shifting between Reynolds and Renee. Chief Carter, I've reviewed the documents you provided, he said, his tone measured. These are serious allegations. Reynolds leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. His confidence hadn't wavered, not yet. Allegations, Your Honor, Reynolds said smoothly, his voice steady. Nothing proven, and let's be honest, the chief here seems to have a personal vendetta against me. Renee stepped forward, her expression unwavering. It's not personal, Officer Reynolds, it's justice. She turned to the judge. Your Honor, I request that all of Sergeant Reynolds' previous excessive force cases be reopened, starting with the case of Jamal Brown. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Reynolds' jaw tightened, the first crack in his carefully constructed facade. The judge nodded, considering her request. I will take that into consideration, Chief Carter. But I must warn you, reopening these cases will be an uphill battle. Renee's expression remained firm. I understand, Your Honor, but it's a battle worth fighting. Reynolds stormed out of the courthouse, his fists clenched. He could feel his power slipping away, and he would not let that happen. Grabbing his phone, he barked into it. Find me something on her. Anything. I don't care if you have to dig up her kindergarten report card. A pause. Then a voice on the other end hesitated. Reynolds, you don't get it. This isn't just some political stunt. Carter's got evidence. Real evidence. Reynolds sneered into the phone. Then we make sure no one sees it. That night, a masked figure slipped into the police department's internal evidence room. Files were pulled, computers wiped. By morning, the case against Reynolds was thinner. But Renee had anticipated this. When she arrived at the station, she found her office ransacked. Papers were scattered across the floor, drawers left open in a chaotic mess. And on her desk, a single sheet of paper. Back off. She picked it up, reading the words slowly. Then she smiled. Reynolds had just made a fatal mistake. She turned to her assistant. Get Internal Affairs on the phone, now. Get me a warrant. I know exactly where to look. The morning air was thick with tension as Renee stood outside the courthouse, a fresh warrant gripped tightly in her hand. The break-in at the department's evidence room had been a desperate move. Reynolds was panicking, and when men like him panicked, they got sloppy. Her instincts told her one thing. Reynolds had an insurance policy, a place where he kept the real dirt hidden, and she knew exactly where to find it. Renee and her team arrived at Reynolds' off-duty storage unit. The storage unit was nothing more than an unassuming metal door in a rundown facility on the outskirts of town. Armed with the warrant, Renee watched as officers cut the lock and pulled the door open. Inside, rows of boxes lined the walls, old case documents, stacks of files. But then, something more chilling caught her eye. A pile of VHS tapes and USB drives, each carefully labeled with names. All victims of Sergeant Reynolds. Renee's breath caught in her throat as she picked up one labeled Marcus Avery, 2012. She knew that name. Marcus Avery had been a black teenager killed during a routine traffic stop. Reynolds had claimed he reached for a weapon, but now, for the first time, there was a chance to uncover the truth. Renee had always suspected there was more to the story. Marcus Avery's case had been buried, ruled justified, with no body cam footage available, no evidence to challenge Reynolds' version of events. But now, the missing footage was right in front of her. Her hands shook as she plugged the USB drive into her laptop. Her team huddled around her, silent, waiting. The screen flickered to life. Reynolds' body cam feed from the night played before them. And the truth was worse than she had imagined. The grainy footage showed Reynolds standing over Marcus Avery's lifeless body. No weapon in sight, no threat. No reason to pull the trigger. Then, with chilling casualness, Reynolds reached into his vest, pulled out a gun, and dropped it next to the boy's hand, planted evidence. His voice, calm and practiced, rang out through the speakers. Officer involved shooting. Suspect reached for a weapon. Send backup. Like it was routine. Like he had done this before. Renee's stomach twisted. But now finally the truth was no longer buried. There was no hesitation, no remorse. Just another cover-up in a long list of them. The room went silent. One of the officers, a young recruit, swallowed hard. Jesus Christ. Renee's jaw tightened. She had always known Reynolds was corrupt. But this was murder, and now she had the proof to bring him down. Meanwhile, Reynolds sat in a dimly lit bar, swirling whiskey in his glass, his mind racing. His phone buzzed. It was his contact from the evidence room. "We have a problem." Reynolds stiffened. "What do you mean?" A pause. Then the voice on the other end dropped to a whisper. "They found the tapes. They found everything." The glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against the floor. No, that's impossible," he muttered, his breath coming short and uneven. His mind raced, scrambling for answers. How could this be happening? For years, he had lived in a world where he was untouchable, but now that world was crumbling. That evening, Renee stood on the steps of the precinct, the glow of camera flashes lighting up the night. Reporters pressed forward, microphones raised. The entire city was watching. She lifted the USB drive for all to see. "In my hands," she said, her voice clear and unwavering, "is undeniable proof that Sergeant Reynolds has been falsifying reports, planting evidence, and covering up his crimes, including the murder of Marcus Avery." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The truth was no longer hidden, and this time, justice would not be denied. Reporters scrambled forward, pushing microphones closer, shouting questions over one another. From a distance, Reynolds watched, his stomach twisting into knots. She wasn't stopping. For the first time in his career, there was no way out. No favors to call in, no higher-ups to shield him. The press conference was everywhere. Every news channel, every headline, every social media platform flooded with the same damning revelation. Sergeant Reynolds, exposed secret footage reveals murder cover-up. His name was now synonymous with corruption. Renee stood firm as the cameras flashed, her voice steady, unwavering. "This is not just about one bad cop," she continued. "This is about a system that allowed him to thrive, a system that protected him, that silenced victims, that buried the truth." She looked directly into the cameras. That ends now. Reynolds had operated without consequence for years, but that ended now. He sat frozen in his car, parked in an empty lot on the outskirts of town. His phone buzzed nonstop messages from fellow officers, his superiors, the union. Some told him to lay low, others cut ties completely. He clenched his jaw, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. They were abandoning him. The very system that had protected him for so long was turning its back. And then, the final blow. His phone rang again. His lawyer. Reynolds hesitated, staring at the screen before answering. The voice on the other end was cold. "Reynolds, we need to talk." The voice on the other end hesitated. "The department is moving to suspend you indefinitely, without pay." Reynolds' stomach twisted. "They can't do that," he hissed. "I have connections, I have leverage." A pause. Then his lawyer's voice came again lower, almost cautious. "They're saying they have the video of Marcus Avery." A sharp silence. "They're saying it's indisputable." Reynolds slammed his fist against the dashboard, his breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. But desperation had a way of making men reckless. Reynolds needed a way out. His last stronghold. His final chance. He stormed into the police union office. Reynolds burst through the doors of the police union office, his anger barely contained. "You can't just throw me to the wolves," he spat. "I did what I had to do. The streets are safer because of me." But the men inside, the same ones who had once laughed at his racist jokes, the ones who had covered for him time and time again, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. No more smirks, no more backslaps. One of them, an older officer, cleared his throat. "Reynolds, you need to get out in front of this. Deny it. Say the footage was edited. Say, 'Are you serious?'" Reynolds cut in, his voice cracking. "You think some fake conspiracy is going to hold up? Carter has the public eating out of her hand." His chest heaved as he looked around the room, searching for allies. But all he saw were men avoiding his gaze. For the first time, he was the liability. "If we don't shut this down now, we're all next." Reynolds snapped, his desperation spilling over. But one of the officers shook his head. "Number, you're next. We're not risking our careers for you." Reynolds' blood ran cold. They were done protecting him. For the first time in his life, he felt what it was like to be powerless. But Renee wasn't done. That night, she issued an official warrant for Reynolds' arrest. Officers arrived at his house, banging on the door. "Police, open up!" But Reynolds was already gone. He had vanished. A full-blown manhunt was now underway. Renee's phone buzzed, a new message. She read it once, then again, and her pulse quickened. A message popped up from an unknown number. "You think you've won? This isn't over." Renee smirked, locking her phone. Oh, but it was only just beginning. The city was on high alert. News stations ran constant breaking reports. Fugitive cop on the run after murder cover-up exposed. Helicopters hovered overhead as officers combed the streets. Every highway checkpoint, airport, and bus station was being monitored. Reynolds had nowhere to go, but Renee knew him. She knew exactly where he'd run. In a matter of hours, Reynolds' world had collapsed. The power, the protection, the arrogance. It was all gone. Now he was just another desperate man on the run. The system he had trusted had discarded him. The same powerful friends who once covered for him now refused to return his calls. Reynolds' hands trembled as he gripped the stolen car's steering wheel, sweat rolling down his face. His career, his reputation, his entire life, gone. But there was one thing left: revenge. Renee stood outside an abandoned warehouse near the docks. She had anticipated this moment. Reynolds was too arrogant to disappear forever. He wouldn't go out quietly. Her phone rang. She answered. "I know you're looking for me, Carter." Reynolds' voice was low, edged with something dangerous. Reynolds' voice rasped through the speaker. "But you don't know how this ends." Renee didn't blink. "I do, actually. It ends with you in cuffs." A cruel chuckle crackled through the line. "You think you've won? You think bringing me down changes anything? The system made me, and when I'm gone, someone just like me will take my place." Renee's jaw tightened. "No, Reynolds. The system let you exist, but change starts today." A rustling sound, then click. The line went dead. She exhaled slowly. He was close. Inside the warehouse, Reynolds crouched behind a stack of crates, his stolen service weapon gripped tightly in his hands. His breath was shallow, his mind racing. He wasn't going to prison, not tonight, not ever. Reynolds clutched the weapon tightly, his knuckles white. He could hear footsteps. Renee had come alone. Good. She stepped into the dimly lit space, her silhouette sharp, unwavering. "Reynolds, it's over." His voice was low, shaking with rage. "You ruined my life." Renee shook her head. "Number you did that." A tense silence. Then he lunged. From the shadows, his gun raised. Bang! A single gunshot echoed through the warehouse. Reynolds staggered back. His gun clattered to the floor. A deep red stain spread across his shoulder. His breathing turned ragged as he collapsed, his world finally fading to black. Reynolds slumped against a crate, his breath ragged. Renee's gun remained steady in her hands. "I told you it was over." Outside, police sirens wailed. The warehouse flooded with officers, weapons drawn, surrounding Reynolds as he sank to his knees. For the first time, he had no power, no control. One of the arresting officers stepped forward, reciting the familiar words. "You have the right to remain silent." The same words Reynolds had coldly spoken to countless innocent men before. Only this time, he was the one in cuffs. As they dragged him to his feet, Reynolds lifted his head, locking eyes with Renee one last time. Pure hatred burned in his gaze. But beneath it, fear, and for Renee, victory. But not just for her. For every victim Reynolds thought would never see justice. Reynolds sat in the cold interrogation room, his once pristine uniform now replaced with an orange jumpsuit. His cuffed hands twitched against the metal table. For years, he had terrorized others in rooms just like this. He had watched men sweat, break, beg. But now, he was the one waiting. The door creaked open. Chief Renee Carter stepped inside, her presence as commanding as ever. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Calmly, she placed a file on the table and pulled up a chair across from him. Reynolds scoffed, forcing a smirk. "Enjoying your victory, Carter?" Reynolds' smirk faltered as Renee opened the file. Inside were pages of complaints, testimonies, and the names of victims. Voices that had been ignored for years. She flipped through the documents, her voice steady. "You're facing multiple charges," she said. "Evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, and most importantly, the murder of Marcus Avery." At the mention of the name, Reynolds' jaw clenched, but Renee didn't stop. "The DA is offering you a deal," she continued. "Plead guilty. Give up the names of your enablers, the ones who covered for you, and you might avoid life in prison." Reynolds let out a bitter laugh. "You actually think I'm gonna talk?" Reynolds' smirk faltered. Renee leaned in, her voice dropping just slightly. "Your own abandoned you the second you became a liability." Silence. She was right. The union, his fellow officers, his connections, they had all turned their backs on him. For the first time in his life, he was truly alone. Weeks later, the courtroom was packed. News cameras lined the back. Citizens, activists, families of victims, all watching. And in the center of it all, Reynolds, standing trial for his crimes. The prosecution laid out the truth he had spent years burying, the planted evidence, the falsified reports, the murders. This time, there was no badge to protect him, no system to shield him, only justice. And justice had finally arrived. The prosecution dismantled the case with brutal efficiency. The body cam footage, the testimonies, the forged reports. There was no escape. Then, Jamal Brown, the young man Reynolds had falsely arrested at the very beginning, took the stand. His voice was steady. "This man treated me like I was nothing," Jamal said. "But today, I'm here to make sure no one else suffers like I did." Renee watched from the front row, her hands clasped. This wasn't revenge. This was justice. When the guilty verdict was read, a wave of emotion rippled through the room. Some gasped, others nodded in quiet relief. But in the end, one truth remained. Reynolds had finally fallen. The system that had once protected him had now condemned him. For the first time, a corrupt officer was held accountable. And for the victims who thought justice would never come, it finally had. Reynolds was sentenced to 25 years without parole. His fall sent shockwaves through the department. A wave of resignations followed. Internal investigations into corruption intensified. Officers who once operated without consequence now found themselves under scrutiny. And for the first time in years, people believed in change. Renee stood outside the courthouse, breathing in the crisp air. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, but she ignored them. Instead, she turned to Jamal, standing beside his mother. "You did good today," she said. Jamal nodded. "So did you." She smiled. This was just the beginning. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm glow over the city. Change had come, and this time, it was here to stay. The sky burned in hues of orange and deep blue as Renee stepped away from the courthouse, the weight of the trial finally lifting from her shoulders. The fight had been long, the scars deep, but today, justice had prevailed. Reynolds was gone, not just from the force, but from the system that had shielded him for years. No more cover-ups, no more lies. Reporters swarmed, microphones shoved in her direction. "Chief Carter, how does it feel to bring down Sergeant Reynolds?" one asked. Renee paused. She could have said it felt good. She could have spoken of victory. But instead, she looked straight into the cameras and said something else. Renee looked directly into the camera, her voice steady, unwavering. "This was never about bringing down one man," she said firmly. "It was about holding a system accountable, a system that let him exist." The cameras flashed, the world listening. She turned, walking down the courthouse steps, past the people who had fought alongside her, past Jamal and his family, past the young black kids who now saw something different. A new future, one where justice wasn't just a promise, but a reality. As she reached her car, her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. One down. Many more to go. Renee exhaled. The fight wasn't over, but change had begun. Change had begun. And this was just the first domino to fall. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, Don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one.